There is a particular quality to silence in high places. In the volcanic highlands of central Anatolia, where the earth rises in slow, exhausted folds above the surrounding plains, the wind moves differently, not with the aggression it carries at sea level, but with a low, deliberate patience, as though it has been traveling for a very long time and has finally arrived somewhere worth stopping. It was in this silence, somewhere between the 7th and 6th millennium before the Common Era, that a small number of people first noticed something that would, over the next 2,000 years, fundamentally reorganize what it meant to be human. They were not looking for revolution. The men and women who first examined the greenish, weathered stones scattered across the Anatolian highlands were craftsmen already skilled in the manipulation of other materials. Flint knappers with decades of accumulated knowledge about fracture patterns and pressure. Obsidian workers who understood precisely how volcanic glass behaved under percussion. Toolmakers whose reputations within their communities rested on an intuitive mastery of stone. They were not dreamers. They were practitioners. And it was exactly their practiced attention, the kind of close, repetitive observation that comes only from years of handling material, that allowed them to notice what others had walked past without seeing. The stones were not remarkable in any immediately obvious way. Copper, in its native form, weathers to a surface coloration ranging from dull green to deep blue-gray, depending on the specific mineral compounds that have formed over millennia of atmospheric exposure. A casual observer might mistake such a nugget for an unusual piece of malachite or a weathered chunk of ordinary stone. But to hands trained in the evaluation of raw material, copper communicated something different. It had a density that was wrong for stone, too heavy for its size, with a peculiar solidity that felt somehow alive, as though the material had a different relationship with gravity than anything else they had handled. And when struck with a hammerstone, it did something no stone had ever done. It did not shatter, it bent. The implications of this single observation, a material that deformed rather than fractured under percussion, took generations to fully absorb. The earliest copper workers, operating at sites across the Anatolian plateau and into the broader region that archaeologists identify as the Fertile Crescent's northwestern periphery, initially treated this new material as they treated everything else, as a medium to be shaped by the techniques they already knew. They hammered it cold, using the same stone tools they applied to flint, discovering in the process that copper could be flattened into sheets, drawn into rods, bent into curves, and hammered to a surface smoothness that no stone could achieve. These were remarkable discoveries, each one arriving not through theoretical reasoning, but through the accumulated evidence of trial and repetition, the slow epistemology of craft. Archaeological excavations at Kayonu Tepesi in southeastern Turkey, a site occupied continuously from approximately 7,200 to 6,000 BC. I have recovered some of the oldest worked copper objects yet discovered. Among the finds are beads, pins, and small flat tools that show the unmistakable tool marks of cold hammering, the surface compression and edge forming that result from repeated percussion against a hard substrate. These objects are modest by any standard. A copper bead measuring perhaps a centimeter in diameter would not, to modern eyes, seem like evidence of a civilizational turning point. But the information encoded in that bead is extraordinary. It tells us that someone understood how to select copper from among other stones, how to soften it through annealing, the process of heating and controlled cooling that relieves internal stress and allows further working, and how to shape it to a predetermined form. The bead is not found. It is made. And the distance between finding and making is the distance between nature and civilization. The social context within which these earliest metalworkers operated was itself undergoing profound transformation. The site of Çatalhöyük, that remarkable cluster of mud brick houses in the Konya Plain, occupied from approximately 7,100 to 5,700 BC, provides the most detailed available picture of life in this transitional world. The settlement, which at its peak may have housed as many as 8,000 people, living in houses so tightly packed that residents entered through openings in the roof rather than through ground-level doors, was a community already accustomed to a degree of specialization that earlier generations would have found extraordinary. Obsidian tools were manufactured by specialists, not by every household for its own use. Textiles were woven by those with particular skill and equipment. The wall paintings that decorated interior spaces, elaborate geometric designs, scenes of hunting and wild animals, repeated images of human hands, required pigments that had to be sourced, prepared, and applied with technical knowledge that not everyone possessed. Into this world of emerging specialization, copper arrived as both tool and symbol. The archaeological evidence from Çatalhöyük reveals workshops within specific houses where copper objects were produced, workshops that were not distributed randomly throughout the settlement, but concentrated in particular locations associated with specific households or family groups. This pattern of concentration is significant. It tells us that from the very beginning, metallurgical knowledge was not a common resource. It was held by specific people, transmitted through specific relationships, and leveraged in specific ways. The craftsmen who worked copper at Çatalhöyük were not simply making tools. They were, whether they recognized it fully or not, accumulating a form of social capital that would prove more durable than any object they produced. The environmental conditions of this early period shaped the possibilities and the pressures of technological innovation in ways that cannot be separated from the social story. Between 5,500 and 4,500 BC, paleoclimatic data recovered from lake sediments in Anatolia and ice cores from Greenland indicates a period of notable climate instability, including a significant cooling event around 5,200 BC that climatologists identify as the 5.2 kilo-year event. This cooling reduced growing seasons across much of Western Asia and Southeastern Europe, placing stress on agricultural systems that were still relatively young and not yet deeply resilient. Communities that had grown dependent on the reliable annual cycle of planting and harvest found themselves facing seasons too short to complete that cycle or too cold to sustain the yields they had come to expect. The response to this stress was, characteristically, innovation. But innovation does not occur in a vacuum. It requires raw materials, accumulated knowledge, social structures capable of supporting specialists, and trading networks capable of distributing both materials and ideas. By 5000 BC, all of these preconditions were beginning to exist across a broad region, stretching from the Balkans through Anatolia into the Levant. Copper deposits, which exist in significant concentrations across this region, particularly in the Carpathian Mountains, the Caucasus foothills, and the mountainous interior of Anatolia, became focal points for a kind of organized human attention that had not previously existed. Systematic, sustained resource extraction with a specific technological goal. The transition from cold hammering of native copper to the smelting of copper ore, extracting the metal from the surrounding rock through the application of high heat, represents one of the most consequential technical leaps in human prehistory. The moment when someone first understood that the green mineral malachite, when heated in the presence of charcoal in a controlled enclosure, would release liquid copper that could be poured into a mold and allowed to solidify in a predetermined shape, that moment opened a door through which everything that followed would eventually pass. It required knowledge of fire management that went beyond what was needed for cooking or warmth. It required ceramic containers that could withstand temperatures in excess of 1085 degrees Celsius, the melting point of copper. It required molds made of stone or clay, designed with an understanding of how molten metal flows and cools, and it required, above all, a theoretical model, however primitive and practical, of what heat does to matter. We do not know who first achieved this understanding. The archaeological record preserves the evidence of the achievement, but not the biography of the achiever. What we can reconstruct. From the debris of ancient workshops and the chemical signatures left in slag and crucible walls is the approximate timeline and geography of this discovery's spread. By 4500 BC, smelting was practiced at multiple sites across the Balkans and Anatolia. By 4000 BC, the technology had spread sufficiently that copper objects were appearing in archaeological contexts across a broad arc from the Aegean to the steppe regions north of the Black Sea. The knowledge traveled, as knowledge always does, along the same routes that goods traveled. The paths worn into the earth by feet and hooves, and the runners of sleds, the waterways navigated by log boats and reed craft, the mountain passes that connected valley system to valley system across the great cordilleras of the ancient world. What was being traded in these early exchange networks? It was not only copper, it was possibility. Each object that arrived in a community from a distant source carried within it the evidence of a technique, a material, a design approach that the receiving community might not have independently developed. A copper axe from the Balkans, arriving in a village in the Po Valley, was not merely a tool. It was an argument, concrete, holdable, demonstrable, for a particular understanding of what metal could do and what it was worth. Communities that found these arguments persuasive and that possessed the social infrastructure to act on them were communities that found themselves, generation by generation, moving toward a different relationship with the material world. Communities that could not or did not engage with these networks found themselves, generation by generation, falling further behind. This is the fundamental dynamic that the Copper Age introduced into human history, not the simple substitution of one material for another, but the creation of a world in which the unequal distribution of technological knowledge, raw materials, and trading relationships began to generate new and durable forms of social inequality. The green-tinged stones on the Anatolian highlands were not, in themselves, the cause of this transformation. They were its occasion, the material trigger for a set of social and economic processes that, once begun, could not easily be stopped. By the time the Copper Age reached its fullest expression in the societies of the Balkans, the Near East, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, the world that had existed before the hammering of that first native copper nugget had become as remote and inaccessible as the pre-linguistic world that preceded the first human utterance. The quiet of the Anatolian highlands, where all of this began, is now broken only by wind and the occasional vehicle on a modern road. The sites where the first metalworkers lived and labored are mostly unexcavated mounds, rising a few meters above the surrounding plain, their interiors still holding the debris of thousands of years of human occupation. In those interiors, patient archaeologists have found the evidence that allows us to reconstruct, in broad outline, what happened. But reconstruction is not experience, the knowledge of what these early craftsmen felt when they first saw copper flow from ore. The shock of it, the excitement, the dawning understanding of what this meant, that knowledge is lost. What remains is the consequence, and the consequence, as we are about to see, was nothing less than the transformation of the human world. The Varna necropolis, where gold and copper first divided the human world, on the western shore of the Black Sea, in what is now the country of Bulgaria, there is an unremarkable stretch of land that archaeologists began excavating in 1972, after construction workers installing an electrical cable encountered something unexpected at a depth of less than a meter. What they had found, beneath a thin layer of modern soil, was the edge of one of the most important burial sites in human prehistory, a cemetery that would, over the following decade of excavation, yield evidence that permanently changed scholarly understanding of how and when human societies began to systematically concentrate wealth and power in the hands of specific individuals and families. The Varna necropolis, as it came to be known, dates to approximately 4,600 to 4,200 BC, the height of what researchers now identify as the Varna culture, a sophisticated society that occupied the coastal regions of present-day northeastern Bulgaria and exploited the trade opportunities created by Black Sea navigation and proximity to the copper-producing regions of the Balkans. The cemetery contained 294 individual graves when excavation was completed, but it was not the number of graves that captured scholarly attention. It was their contents, and more specifically, the extraordinary variation in those contents that made Varna a site of permanent archaeological significance. Most graves at Varna contained what one would expect from a settled agricultural community of this period: pottery vessels, flint tools, occasionally some animal bones representing food offerings. The ordinary material accompaniments of an ordinary life concluded. A minority of graves contained something very different. Grave 43, the most spectacular individual burial at the site and one of the most remarkable ever discovered in prehistoric Europe, held the remains of a middle-aged male accompanied by an assemblage of objects so extravagant in its wealth and so sophisticated in its craftsmanship that it required archaeologists to fundamentally revise their understanding of how early this level of social stratification had existed in the ancient world. The inventory of Grave 43 is worth describing in some detail, not for the pleasure of cataloging luxury, but because each item tells a specific story about the social and technological world that produced it. The burial included more than 990 separate gold objects with a combined weight exceeding 1.5 kilograms, a figure that becomes meaningful only when one understands that gold in this period was not mined from large deposits but accumulated through the painstaking panning of riverbeds and the collection of alluvial nuggets, grain by grain, over the course of what must have been many human lifetimes. There were gold rings worn on fingers that had long since dissolved into the surrounding soil. There were gold appliques, thin hammered discs that had once decorated clothing. The clothing itself gone, but the gold ornaments preserving in their distribution across the skeleton a ghost image of garments that were rich enough in decoration to rival anything worn by rulers of far later civilizations. There was a scepter-like object with a gold-hafted handle, suggesting ceremonial authority. And there were copper objects as well, axes with gold-decorated hafts, tools whose functional purpose was overwhelmed by their symbolic elaboration. What does this burial tell us? It tells us, first and most directly, that wealth on this scale could be accumulated by an individual, that the social and economic systems of the Varna culture had already developed mechanisms, however informal, for concentrating resources in particular hands. This is not a modest conclusion. The ability to accumulate wealth across a lifetime and to have that wealth recognized and preserved in death requires a particular kind of social contract, one that acknowledges individual rather than collective ownership. That maintains the value of precious objects across exchange relationships, and that possesses some means of transmitting accumulated resources between generations. None of these things are universal features of human social organization. They are specific achievements, hard-won through generations of social evolution, and their presence at Varna in the late 5th millennium BC places the origins of wealth-based hierarchy considerably earlier than many scholars had previously imagined. The cemetery also contained a category of burial that is particularly revealing: the so-called cenotaph, or symbolic grave, a burial that contains rich assemblages of objects but no human remains. These empty graves, of which Varna contained several, are not the result of ancient grave robbers or poor preservation. They were intentional from the beginning, graves prepared for individuals whose physical bodies were absent, perhaps because they had died at sea, or in a distant place, or in circumstances that made recovery of the body impossible. The significance of the cenotaphs lies in what they imply about the social standing of their intended occupants, that these individuals were considered important enough that the community felt compelled to perform the full ritual of burial, even without a body to bury. Social status in the Varna world was not merely a characteristic of living individuals. It was a permanent attribute that persisted even in death and even in absence. The technological sophistication required to produce the Varna grave goods deserves particular attention, because it illuminates the degree to which metallurgical expertise had already advanced by this early date. The gold objects from the richest Varna burials were not produced by simple hammering of native gold nuggets. They required a command of techniques that we would today recognize as requiring years of training. The production of gold wire thin enough to be woven into decorative elements. The creation of sheet gold hammered to uniform thinness across large areas. The joining of multiple gold components through techniques that required precise temperature control, and the surface finishing that produced the characteristic visual impact of Varna gold objects, their luminous, flawlessly smooth surfaces that catch and hold light in ways that demonstrate the maker's complete control over the material's optical properties. Similar sophistication is evident in the copper objects found in the richest graves. The copper axes recovered from Varna, objects heavy enough to serve as actual working tools, their blades ground to a functional edge, show evidence of both cold hammering and casting, indicating that the craftsmen who produced them had mastered the full range of available copper working techniques. The hafting systems used to attach copper blades to wooden handles were designed with an understanding of the mechanical stresses involved in actual use, the way a blade needs to be seated to resist both the shock of impact and the twisting forces that occur when a tool meets resistance at an angle. These were not decorative imitations of tools. They were tools, made with great skill and then elaborated with great artistry to serve a second function as symbols of status and power. The social implications of the Varna evidence extend well beyond what a single cemetery can directly tell us. To understand Varna fully, we need to understand the broader cultural context, the network of settlements and exchange relationships within which this community operated. The Varna culture was not an isolated phenomenon. It was one component of a broader pattern of social complexity that had developed across southeastern Europe during the 5th millennium BC, driven in part by the expansion of copper production and the trade networks that copper had generated, and in part by the agricultural surpluses that increasingly productive farming techniques were making possible across the fertile soils of the Danube Basin and the Black Sea coastal plains. Settlements throughout this region show evidence of the same basic social processes that the Varna cemetery documents: the concentration of craft production in specific households, the differential access to imported materials and prestige goods, and the emerging association between wealth and hereditary status rather than achieved status. At Durankulak, another Black Sea coastal site, burial evidence suggests that high-status individuals were consistently buried in particular areas of the cemetery, and that the wealth of graves correlated with the apparent age and hence experience of the deceased, rather than with any single dramatic event like military victory. Wealth, in other words, was accumulating over lifetimes and being passed between generations, the definition of hereditary inequality. The trade networks that supplied both raw materials and finished goods to the Varna culture were extensive and well organized enough to challenge any simple model of prehistoric commerce as a collection of small-scale, local exchanges. Copper objects found at Varna and related sites carry chemical signatures indicating ore sources in the Carpathian Mountains, more than 300 kilometers to the northwest. Gold appears to have come from riverbeds in Thrace and potentially from more distant sources. Spondylus shells, large, beautiful marine shells whose bright orange interior was prized as a decorative material throughout this period, arrived from the Aegean coast, requiring a journey of at least 700 kilometers by whatever route the trade took. The logistics of maintaining these exchange relationships across such distances, without wheeled vehicles or horses for transport, without writing for record-keeping, and without the formal institutional structures that we associate with organized trade, are genuinely remarkable. The answer to how this was managed lies, most likely, in the social relationships between trading partners, the webs of kinship, alliance, and mutual obligation that connected communities across the region, and that made long-distance exchange not merely possible, but socially mandatory. Gift exchange, in which the transfer of valuable objects creates and maintains obligations between parties, is a well-documented feature of human societies at many levels of complexity. At Varna period levels of social organization, the exchange of copper axes, gold ornaments, and spondylus shells was almost certainly embedded in exactly this kind of relationship network, a system in which the objects themselves were less important than the social relationships they instantiated and maintained. The political consequences of controlling such networks were, as the Varna evidence suggests, substantial. Communities situated at nodes of exchange, places where trade routes intersected, where raw materials were available and could be processed, where the right combination of agricultural surplus and craft expertise existed, were communities that could leverage their position to accumulate extraordinary wealth, and communities that accumulated extraordinary wealth were, as the Varna cemetery so vividly demonstrates, communities in which specific individuals and families could translate that wealth into a form of social power that persisted across generations and was proclaimed in death through rituals of burial that made inequality visible and permanent. The man in grave 43, whoever he was, whatever specific roles he played in the life of his community, was buried in a way that announced his status to everyone who witnessed the burial and to every future person who might disturb the grave. The more than 1.5 kilograms of gold that accompanied him into the earth were not there by accident or by random chance. They were there because the people who buried him believed and wanted others to believe that he had deserved them, that his life had been lived in a way that justified this extraordinary concentration of resources in his honor. Whether they were right about that is a question we cannot now answer. What we can say is that they inhabited a world in which such a question could be meaningfully asked and in which the answer could be expressed in gold. That world, the world of wealth-based status and hereditary inequality, is a world we still inhabit today. Varna is where it begins to become fully visible in the archaeological record. But as we will see in the chapters that follow, it was not destined to remain a phenomenon confined to the Black Sea coast. The rise of Cucuteni Tripilia and the mystery of the vanished urban world. Between approximately 4,500 and 3,500 BC, something happened in the fertile belt of land stretching across what are now Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine that has no real parallel anywhere else in the ancient world at the same period of time. In the valleys of the Dnieper, the Bug, and the Dniester rivers, and across the broad plains that separate them, communities of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture built settlements of a size and internal complexity that did not reappear in Europe until the Roman period. Settlements that housed thousands, and in some cases, tens of thousands, of people within organized, planned boundaries, and that sustained this population density through agricultural and craft production systems of extraordinary sophistication. The discovery and interpretation of these settlements has been one of the more gradual revelations in the history of European archaeology. Early excavations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries encountered the characteristic pottery of the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, those immediately recognizable vessels with their spiraling geometric designs in black and red on cream-colored backgrounds, and understood that they were dealing with a significant and widespread prehistoric tradition. But the true scale of the settlements was not apparent until the development of aerial photography and, more recently, of magnetometer survey techniques that can detect buried structural features without excavation. When these methods were applied to sites across Ukraine in particular, the results were startling. At Talyanki, a site in central Ukraine, magnetometer surveys revealed the buried remnants of more than 1,600 individual structures arranged in a pattern of concentric rings around a central open space, covering an area of approximately 335 hectares. Estimates of the population that occupied this settlement at its peak, around 4,100 BC, range from 10,000 to 15,000 individuals, figures that place Talyanki in the same demographic category as the early Sumerian cities of Mesopotamia, despite being separated from them by thousands of kilometers and developing without apparent direct contact. At Nebelivka in Ukraine, another giant settlement covering approximately 238 hectares, surveys revealed a similarly organized community, with large assembly buildings positioned at the center of the settlement's circular layout, suggesting some form of communal or ritual architecture at the heart of the social organization. The houses that made up these communities were substantial structures by any prehistoric standard, built using a technique that combined timber framing with a mixture of clay, straw, and organic material, the wattle and daub construction that would remain a staple of rural architecture across much of Europe well into the medieval period. The Cucuteni Tripilia house typically measured between 8 and 12 meters in length and included multiple interior spaces serving different functions. Ground floors appear to have served primarily as work and storage areas, with evidence of purpose-built ovens for pottery firing integrated into the domestic architecture itself. Upper levels, where they have been reconstructed from the evidence of fallen structural elements, provided living space for extended family groups. The pottery produced in these houses, in domestic kilns within individual structures, rather than in centralized production facilities, is among the most technically accomplished ceramic work of its era anywhere in the world. The characteristic Cucuteni Tripilia vessel, with its complex interlocking spiral designs achieved through a multi-stage painting and firing process, required a level of technical expertise and aesthetic judgment that implies not merely individual skill, but a tradition of systematic training and accumulated knowledge transmission. The designs themselves are standardized enough across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers to suggest that some form of shared cultural grammar governed their production, a set of conventions about which motifs were appropriate, how they should be arranged, and what quality standards they should meet. Chemical analysis of Cucuteni Tripilia pottery has revealed something particularly interesting about the raw materials used in its production. Clay was being transported to production sites from sources located up to 50 kilometers away. This is not a trivial logistical achievement for a society without wheeled transport or pack animals. The movement of clay in quantities sufficient to supply the prolific pottery production of a community like Talianki, where excavations have recovered fragments representing literally millions of vessels, required organized procurement systems, regular expeditions to distant clay sources, systematic collection and transport of raw material, and probably some form of coordination among different households or production groups to manage the supply chain efficiently. Copper working within the Cucuteni Tripilia world reflected both the general level of social organization and the specific opportunities created by proximity to the copper-producing regions of the Carpathian Mountains. Metallurgical debris, slag fragments, crucible remnants, partially worked copper pieces, has been recovered from numerous settlement sites, indicating that copper working was practiced at a community level rather than being confined to specialized production centers. The objects produced ranged from simple flat tools like chisels and awls to more elaborate items, including decorative pins, bracelets, and pendants that served as markers of status and identity. The organization of these large settlements raises questions that remain genuinely contested among researchers. How were communities of 10 or 15,000 people managed in the absence of the administrative technologies, writing, standardized weights and measures, specialized bureaucratic institutions that we normally associate with governance at this scale? How were disputes resolved, resources allocated, labor organized for collective tasks like the maintenance of the settlement's infrastructure? The archaeological evidence suggests several partial answers. The large central structures at sites like Nebelivka appear to have served as meeting places for community-level decision-making, analogues to the council houses found in many historically documented non-state societies. The arrangement of the settlement in concentric rings, with different zones perhaps associated with different kinship groups or occupational specializations, would have created a spatial organization that was itself a form of governance, a way of knowing where everyone fit and what their relationships to others were. One of the most enigmatic features of the Cucuteni-Tripilia settlements is the phenomenon of deliberate house burning that appears, from the archaeological evidence, to have been a regular feature of their social life. At numerous sites across the cultural region, excavations have revealed layers of thoroughly burned structures, not the random, localized burning patterns that would result from accidental fires, but systematic firing that consumed entire neighborhoods and sometimes entire settlements. The burned structures were then typically abandoned rather than rebuilt on the same foundations, suggesting that these burning episodes marked endings rather than accidents. The interpretation of this deliberate burning has generated considerable scholarly debate. One influential view holds that periodic burning was a ritual practice, a form of structured abandonment that allowed communities to symbolically close one phase of their collective existence before beginning another. Some researchers have proposed connections to agricultural cycles, suggesting that the burning of a settlement might have been associated with the deliberate fallowing of surrounding agricultural land, allowing both the community and its resource base to regenerate. Others have suggested that the burning may have had practical motivations related to pest control or the management of accumulated organic debris in densely inhabited spaces. None of these explanations is fully satisfying, and it remains possible that the practice served multiple simultaneous purposes that we cannot neatly separate from one another. What is clear is that the Cucuteni-Tripilia communities maintained their settlement pattern, their preference for large, planned, dense communities, across many generations and many episodes of burning and rebuilding. This continuity in the face of what must have been substantial disruption speaks to the robustness of the social model and the degree to which it met the needs of the people who lived within it. The fact that this model eventually failed, that the mega-settlements were ultimately abandoned, their populations dispersing into smaller communities across a wider area, is one of the great puzzles of European prehistory, and one to which we will return. The agricultural foundations that supported populations of the density achieved by the largest Cucuteni-Tripilia settlements were not simple extensions of earlier farming practices. Archaeobotanical evidence from excavated sites shows crop assemblages of considerable diversity. Emmer wheat and einkorn, barley, lentils, flax, and multiple varieties of millet, arranged in cultivation patterns that appear to have involved systematic rotation of fields and deliberate management of soil fertility. The scale of storage facilities at the largest sites, rooms designed to hold substantial grain reserves against the uncertainty of future harvests, indicates that communities were consistently producing surpluses beyond immediate consumption needs. This surplus was the material foundation for everything else. The specialists in pottery, copper working, and other crafts who did not themselves produce food. The exchange relationships with neighboring communities that provided access to materials not locally available, and the social rituals, feasting, gift-giving, ceremony, through which community cohesion was maintained across populations too large for face-to-face relationships among all members. The decline of the Cucuteni-Tripilia mega-settlements which appears to have occurred between approximately 3,500 and 3000 BC, was probably the result of multiple reinforcing pressures rather than any single cause. Paleoclimatic data for this period indicates a general trend toward cooler, drier conditions across the Pontic steppe region, conditions less favorable to the intensive agriculture that had supported the large settlements. Soil depletion, resulting from centuries of intensive cultivation without the benefit of technologies like iron plows that would later dramatically expand agricultural productivity, may have reduced the yield potential of land surrounding the largest communities. The deterioration of the agricultural base would have reduced the surplus that supported specialists and trade, which would in turn have reduced the social cohesion that held large communities together, which would in turn have reduced the collective capacity to manage the agricultural system effectively. Once begun, such a spiral of decline can be very difficult to reverse. There is also evidence in the later phases of Cucuteni Tripilia cultural development of increasing pressure from the pastoral communities of the Pontic steppe to the east, communities that had developed a very different relationship with their landscape, centered on the herding of cattle, sheep, and increasingly horses, and organized around mobility rather than fixed settlement. The encounter between these two very different models of social organization and the conflicts that it appears to have generated added another dimension of stress to communities already struggling with environmental and agricultural challenges. By the time the last of the mega-settlements was abandoned, around 3000 BC, the world in which they had flourished had changed so thoroughly that nothing quite like them would appear in Europe again for another 2.5 millennia. How the Ubaid people tamed the rivers and built the blueprint for every city that followed water is both the most generous and the most dangerous substance on Earth. In the flat, sun-blasted plain between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers, the land that ancient peoples called the land between the rivers and that we call Mesopotamia, water arrived each year in quantities that could sustain millions of people, but that, unmanaged, could also destroy everything that human labor had built. The annual flood of the twin rivers, driven by snowmelt in the mountains of eastern Anatolia, was a force of such regularity and such violence that it organized the entire social world of the people who chose to inhabit the alluvial plain. The flood came. The communities that survived it were the ones that had learned to channel it, contain it, distribute its benefits, and recover from its excesses. And the knowledge of how to do these things was the most valuable knowledge that existed in this part of the world during the 5th millennium BC. The Ubaid period, spanning from approximately 5500 to 3500 BC, marks the first sustained attempt by human communities to inhabit the southern alluvial plain of Mesopotamia at scale, to build permanent settlements in a landscape that offered extraordinary agricultural potential, but that demanded equally extraordinary investments in water management infrastructure. The earliest Ubaid communities were modest in size, their houses built from the reed bundles and mud bricks that were the only available construction materials on a plain virtually devoid of stone or timber. but they were organized around a technological insight that would prove to be among the most consequential in human history: that the annual flood could be captured in canals, stored in basins, and released in controlled quantities to irrigate agricultural fields throughout the year, rather than only during the brief seasonal inundation. Irrigation agriculture in the southern Mesopotamian plain is not simply a matter of digging channels and directing water onto fields. It is a continuous engineering challenge that requires managing soil salinity, the accumulation of mineral salts left behind as irrigation water evaporates, which can render land infertile within decades if not addressed through careful drainage and field management. It requires coordinating the water use of multiple communities sharing the same canal system, with all the potential for conflict that such coordination implies. It requires maintaining the physical infrastructure of canals, embankments, and distribution structures against the erosive power of the water itself and the regular threat of flood damage. And it requires a social organization capable of mobilizing the labor necessary for all of this maintenance, while also adjudicating the inevitable disputes that arise when communities compete for access to the same scarce resource. The institutional response to these challenges, as we can reconstruct it from the archaeological evidence, centered on the temple. From the earliest levels of Ubaid occupation at sites like Eridu, a site whose excavated sequence spans 18 successive building phases and 2,000 years of continuous occupation, the most architecturally prominent structure in the settlement was the temple, a building elevated above its surroundings on a raised platform, constructed with greater care and more durable materials than the surrounding houses, and dedicated to a divine patron whose authority encompassed not only spiritual matters, but the practical management of the community's agricultural system. The temple at Eridu, rebuilt and elaborated repeatedly through the Ubaid period, was not merely a place of worship. It was an administrative headquarters, a storage facility, a workshop, and a redistributive center. A place where agricultural surplus was collected, processed, and reallocated according to the priorities of the community's religious and administrative leadership. Temple storerooms held grain, tools, and raw materials. Temple workshops produced the copper objects, ceramic vessels, and textile goods that the institution both consumed and distributed. Temple administrators, a class of specialist managers whose time was freed from direct agricultural labor by the surplus produced by the system they managed, kept records of production, distribution, and exchange using systems that, while not yet writing in the formal sense, represent the earliest precursors to the written accounting that would emerge at the end of the Ubaid period. Copper, working within this temple-centered institutional framework, acquired a character that was quite different from the household-level production that characterized contemporary communities in the Balkans or the Cucuteni Tripilia world. In Mesopotamia, copper was associated from a relatively early date with religious authority and ceremonial function. The copper vessels, figurines, and ritual implements found in Ubaid period temple contexts were not simply functional objects that happened to be stored in a religious setting. They were objects produced specifically for religious use, under the supervision of temple authorities, with a quality and elaboration that reflected the sacred nature of their purpose. The craftsmen who produced these objects worked within the institutional framework of the temple, as employees, in a loose sense, of an institution that controlled their access to raw materials, specified the form and quality of the objects they produced, and distributed those objects according to priorities that were simultaneously economic, political, and religious. This institutional embedding of copper production had profound consequences for the social role of the metalworker in Mesopotamian society. Unlike the independent craft specialists of the Varna world, who appear to have operated on their own account and leveraged their expertise to accumulate personal status and wealth, the Ubaid period copper worker in Mesopotamia was primarily an agent of institutional production, someone whose skills were valuable, but whose authority derived from the institution they served rather than from their personal control of technical knowledge. This does not mean that Mesopotamian copper workers lacked status. The technical expertise required to produce the sophisticated cast copper objects found in Ubaid period temple contexts was clearly recognized and rewarded, but it was a status that expressed itself differently, as honor within an institutional hierarchy rather than as independent economic power. The expansion of irrigation infrastructure during the Ubaid period created what archaeologists describe as the Ubaid expansion, a spread of Mesopotamian cultural practices, architectural styles, and pottery traditions that extended across much of the northern Persian Gulf region and into the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. This expansion has been interpreted in various ways, but the most persuasive reading of the evidence suggests that it was primarily a commercial phenomenon, the establishment of trading relationships between the increasingly productive agricultural heartland of southern Mesopotamia and the resource-rich but less agriculturally productive regions of the north and east, which could supply the metals, timber, and luxury materials that the alluvial plain entirely lacked. The copper that Ubaid period craftsmen worked in their temple workshops arrived from distant sources through trade networks that extended to the Zagros foothills, the mountains of eastern Anatolia, and eventually to the copper-rich regions of Arabia. The logistics of maintaining these supply lines, the organized expeditions to distant sources, the transport of heavy raw materials across hundreds of kilometers of difficult terrain, the management of exchange relationships with communities whose languages, customs, and social organizations differed markedly from those of the Mesopotamian heartland, required institutional capabilities that pushed the Ubaid temple system toward increasing levels of administrative complexity. The social stratification that accompanied the growth of Ubaid period communities is clearly visible in burial evidence and in the differential elaboration of residential architecture. At sites like Ur and Uruk, which would eventually become the world's first truly urban centers, Ubaid period occupation layers reveal a society in which access to imported materials, elaborated household goods, and larger, more carefully constructed residences was systematically unequal. The families that occupied the largest houses and possessed the greatest quantities of imported goods were, in all probability, the families whose members held positions within the temple administration. the managers and priests whose institutional roles gave them privileged access to the surplus that the agricultural system produced. This was inequality of a different kind than the wealth display inequality documented at Varna. The Varna evidence suggests a social world in which individual accumulation and personal prestige were the primary mechanisms of status differentiation. The Ubaid evidence suggests a world in which institutional position, one's role within a hierarchical organization that claimed authority from divine sanction, was the primary determinant of social standing. Both models would prove durable and influential. The European tradition would elaborate the personal accumulation model into the aristocracies and merchant classes of later periods. The Mesopotamian tradition would elaborate the institutional authority model into the palace bureaucracies and priestly hierarchies of the Bronze Age civilizations that followed. That both these traditions were already distinguishable in the 5th millennium BC is one of the more remarkable insights that careful archaeological analysis makes available. By the end of the Ubaid period, around 3500 BC, the communities of southern Mesopotamia had created something genuinely new in the human world. Cities, not merely large villages, not merely ceremonial centers with small permanent populations, but true cities, dense, economically integrated, institutionally governed communities of tens of thousands of people, sustained by agricultural systems of sufficient productivity to support an urban population that did not itself produce food. The achievements of the Ubaid period in irrigation technology, institutional organization, and craft specialization were the necessary preconditions for this urban emergence. Copper was woven through all of it, in the temple workshops, in the tools that built and maintained the irrigation infrastructure, in the ceremonial objects that proclaimed the divine authority of the institutions that held the whole system together. The sea routes that connected a world and the strategic city that controlled them all. To stand at the Dardanelles Strait on a clear day is to understand immediately why the ancient world cared so much about this place. The water is only 1.5 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, and it moves with a steady, powerful current driven by the difference in water levels between the Black Sea to the northeast and the Aegean to the southwest. Ships moving from one sea to the other have no choice but to pass through this corridor, and for much of the prehistoric period, the community best positioned to observe, tax, assist, or obstruct that passage occupied a limestone ridge overlooking the European shore of the strait, a ridge that later generations would know by many names, but that archaeologists identify by its Turkish designation. Hisarlik, the place of the fortress, the earliest occupation of this ridge, which forms the foundation levels of what would become the city of Troy, dates to approximately 3500 BC, the beginning of what archaeologists call Troy I, the first of 9 major occupation phases that the site would accumulate over the following 3,000 years. The people who built the original settlement at Hisarlik were responding to a geographic opportunity that they may not have fully understood in theoretical terms, but that their practical experience of trade and navigation had made unmistakably clear. Controlling this crossing was controlling the most valuable strategic position in the eastern Mediterranean world. The Aegean, in the late 4th millennium BC, was becoming, for the first time in history, a genuinely interconnected maritime space. Communities along its coasts, on the mainland of Greece, on the islands scattered across its surface, on the Anatolian shore to the east, had developed sufficient navigational capability to maintain regular commercial relationships with partners separated by hundreds of kilometers of open water. The boats that made these voyages were not large by later standards. Reconstructions based on fragmentary remains and iconographic evidence suggest craft between 10 and 20 meters in length, with shallow drafts suited to both open water passages and the beach landings that were the primary mode of docking in an era before purpose-built harbor facilities were common. But they were seaworthy enough, in the hands of experienced crews, to make the crossings between island chains and coastal stretches that constituted the Aegean trade routes. What moved along these routes was the material substance of social complexity: copper from the Cyclades and from Anatolian sources, obsidian from the volcanic island of Melos, which had been the premier source of this glass-like stone for tool-making since the Mesolithic period, tin from sources that remain imperfectly identified, but that likely included deposits in Anatolia and the broader eastern Mediterranean region, and a range of luxury and prestige materials, fine pottery, marine shells, colored stones, precious metals, whose value was cultural rather than utilitarian. The communities that participated most actively in these exchange networks were the communities that accumulated the resources and relationships necessary for further participation. A feedback loop in which commercial success bred further commercial opportunity. Troy I and its successor, Troy II, dating to approximately 2900 to 2200 BC, were communities that had positioned themselves at the center of this feedback loop. The archaeological evidence from Hisarlik at this level reveals a fortified settlement whose architecture reflects both substantial wealth and significant strategic concern. The walls that enclosed the settlement were built from limestone blocks that required quarrying, transport, and skilled construction, an investment of labor that implies both the resources to fund such a project and the perceived threat that made such protection necessary. The houses within the walls were substantial, multi-room structures with stone foundations, ground floors serving as workshops and storage areas, upper stories providing living quarters. The metallurgical workshops at Troy II have yielded material of remarkable technical quality. Copper axes from this level show sophisticated casting techniques, the use of two-piece molds that could produce objects with complex three-dimensional forms, and the precise management of metal composition that produced alloys with properties optimized for specific applications. Chemical analysis of copper artifacts from Hisarlik reveals the exploitation of ore sources from multiple geographic regions: the Taurus Mountains to the south, the Pontic Ranges to the northeast, and possibly more distant sources accessed through the maritime trade networks in which the community participated. The famous treasure of Priam, discovered by Heinrich Schliemann in 1873 and subsequently identified as belonging to Troy, to rather than to the Homeric period, provides a concentrated illustration of the wealth that could be accumulated through strategic commercial positioning. The treasure, now distributed across several European museums after a complicated history that included Schliemann's removal of it from Turkey and its eventual disclosure by the Pushkin Museum in Moscow, includes gold and silver vessels, gold jewelry of extraordinary technical sophistication, bronze weapons, and a range of other precious objects whose combined value in any period would represent extraordinary wealth. Whether these objects were the personal possessions of a ruler, a sacred hoard maintained by a religious institution, or something else entirely, they testify to the capacity of the Troy community to accumulate resources on a scale that few contemporary communities elsewhere in the Mediterranean world could match. The development of maritime infrastructure during this period extended well beyond the construction of ships. Harbor facilities, while modest by the standards of later antiquity, were beginning to appear at strategically located coastal sites, stone-built landing areas, breakwaters that provided protection for beached vessels during storms, storage facilities positioned near the water's edge for handling cargo. At sites like Liman Tepe on the Turkish coast, archaeological evidence reveals harbor installations dating to the 3rd millennium BC that demonstrate an understanding of tidal patterns, wave action, and coastal erosion sophisticated enough to produce structures that survived not just individual storms, but centuries of use. Navigation itself was developing during this period in ways that extended the range and reliability of maritime commerce. The Aegean is a forgiving sea for early navigation in that it is dotted with islands, rarely more than a day's sail apart, so that a vessel navigating from mainland Greece to the Anatolian coast need never lose sight of land for more than a few hours. But the open water passages between island groups and the longer coastal voyages that connected the Aegean to the eastern Mediterranean beyond required navigational knowledge of seasonal wind patterns, of current systems, of celestial markers and their relationship to compass directions that could only be accumulated through generations of systematic observation and transmission. The communities that developed and maintained this navigational knowledge were communities with access to a form of expertise as valuable as metallurgical skill and as carefully controlled. The pilots who could reliably guide a cargo-laden vessel from Troy through the Dardanelles to the Bosphorus and into the Black Sea, or from the Greek mainland to Egypt with its precious metals and linen, were professionals whose knowledge represented capital that could not easily be replicated or replaced. They occupied a social position that combined practical indispensability with the prestige of mastery over a dangerous and mysterious domain. The sea, which could destroy in hours what land-based communities had taken generations to build. The circulation of copper through these maritime networks had consequences that extended well beyond the economic. Each shipment of copper that arrived in a community from a distant source arrived accompanied by information about the techniques used to produce it, about the social relationships that had made the exchange possible, about the relative abundance or scarcity of the material in different regions. This information shaped the decisions of local metalworkers and local leaders about where to invest their labor and their social relationships, whether to intensify local production or to focus on building the exchange relationships that provided access to distant supplies. Over generations, these individual decisions aggregated into the patterns of regional specialization and interdependence that we can observe in the distribution of metallurgical traditions across the Aegean and Anatolian world. Troy's role in this system was not merely passive. The community at Hisarlik was not simply a geography that commerce happened to pass through. It was an active agent in shaping the commercial landscape, controlling access through the strait, providing services to vessels passing through, and leveraging its strategic position to extract value from the traffic that its location made inevitable. This is the beginning of a pattern in the history of trade that would repeat itself many times in many places. The community that controls a bottleneck controls the wealth that passes through it, and that control generates the resources necessary to build and maintain the institutional structures, the fortifications, the administrative systems, the ceremonial facilities that reinforce the community's power and make that control more secure. Troy in the Copper Age was already engaged in this virtuous cycle. The later fame of the city, the siege that Homer would eventually celebrate, was not despite this history, but because of it. Egypt's brutal mining empire and the metal that built the world's first unified state. The eastern desert of Egypt is among the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth. Temperatures in summer exceed 45 degrees Celsius in the shade, and shade is a concept the desert treats as a mere suggestion, rarely implementing it with any generosity. Water exists in theory, known to the desert's sparse inhabitants through the locations of scattered wells and seasonal wadi flows, but in practice it requires effort and knowledge to find, and the effort required to carry sufficient quantities of it into the interior is itself a significant logistical constraint on any enterprise that ventures far from the Nile Valley. The terrain is jagged, cut by the dry channels of wadis that channeled ancient rains, but that now serve primarily as corridors for the movement of wind and the occasional flash flood, their floors strewn with angular fragments of weathered rock that punish the feet of anyone who walks them. Into this landscape, beginning around 3800 BC, Egyptian communities sent expeditions, organized, provisioned, equipped with the specialized tools of mining and metalworking, and led by individuals with sufficient knowledge of both the terrain and the technical requirements of copper extraction to manage the enterprise over the weeks or months it required. The destinations were the copper deposits scattered through the eastern desert, and, more importantly for later periods, the deposits of the Sinai Peninsula across the Red Sea, particularly the sites at Serabit el-Qadim and Wadi Magara, where copper ore occurred in concentrations sufficient to justify the extraordinary logistical investment required to reach and exploit them. The organization of these early mining expeditions provides a window into the administrative capabilities that pre-dynastic Egyptian communities had developed by the late 4th millennium BC. The inscriptions that survive from later, historically documented mining expeditions describe the logistical requirements in terms that suggest little had changed from the earlier period. Hundreds of workers, organized into teams with specialized functions. quantities of food and water sufficient to sustain a large workforce in a waterless environment for extended periods. Copper and stone tools for the actual mining work, ceramic crucibles and fuel for on-site smelting of ore, and the administrative personnel who managed the distribution of supplies, the recording of production quantities, and the transport of processed copper back to the Nile Valley. The mining techniques developed for the hard rock formations of the Egyptian desert were more sophisticated than the relatively simple methods that had sufficed for the surface and near-surface deposits that earlier copper workers in Anatolia and the Balkans had exploited. The eastern desert deposits were often deeply buried, requiring the sinking of vertical shafts through solid rock, followed by the excavation of horizontal galleries that followed the ore veins through the surrounding stone. The fire-setting technique, heating rock faces with wood fires to create differential thermal expansion that loosened the stone, then quenching the heated surface with water to propagate fractures, allowed miners to work through formations too hard for copper or stone tools alone, at the cost of consuming enormous quantities of fuel that had to be carried into the desert from distant forested areas. The processing of copper ore at these remote mining sites required the construction of temporary but technically functional smelting installations, furnaces built from local stone and clay, bellows systems for maintaining the high airflow necessary to achieve the temperatures required for copper extraction, and slag disposal areas that accumulated the waste material from smelting operations over many years of use. The quality of the copper produced at these remote sites was controlled through alloying practices that added specific amounts of arsenic, antimony, or, progressively during this period, tin to the copper, creating alloys with predictable and useful properties, greater hardness, improved edge retention, better resistance to the corrosion that plain copper develops relatively quickly. The copper produced through this demanding and expensive extraction process was used for purposes that illuminated the central priorities of pre-dynastic Egyptian society. Agricultural tools, hoes, sickles, irrigation implements were among the earliest applications, reflecting the primacy of Nile Valley agriculture as the economic foundation of Egyptian civilization. Construction tools, chisels, saws, wood drill bits appeared in archaeological contexts associated with the increasingly ambitious architectural projects of the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, and weapons, mace heads, axes, spear points became increasingly prominent as the political competition that would eventually result in the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under a single ruler intensified in the period between 3200 and 3100 BC. The role of copper weapons in the unification of Egypt is one of the clearer examples in the archaeological record of the relationship between metallurgical advantage and political power. The communities of Upper Egypt, particularly the polity centered at Hierakonpolis near the first cataract of the Nile, developed metallurgical capabilities and military organizations that gave them decisive advantages in the conflicts that characterized the late pre-dynastic period. The famous Narmer palette, one of the earliest historical documents from any civilization, depicts the king who is widely understood to represent the completion of the unification process, wielding a mace. a copper-headed weapon whose effectiveness against unarmored opponents wearing woven linen was documented in the traumatic evidence of fractured skulls and broken bones that archaeologists have recovered from battlefield contexts of this period. The symbolic weight of copper weaponry in Egyptian culture extended far beyond its practical military function. The mace, in particular, a weapon whose form derived from the stone maces of earlier periods, but whose effectiveness was greatly enhanced by the weight and workmanship of copper heads, became one of the primary symbols of pharaonic authority, depicted in relief after relief on temple walls across Egypt for 3,000 years. This symbolic persistence reflects something important about how the Egyptians understood the relationship between metal, power, and divine authority. The transformation of ore into copper, the extraction of a useful, beautiful, durable material from apparently inert rock through the application of fire and expertise, was understood in Egyptian religious thought as a creative act parallel to the divine creation of the world. The craftsmen who performed this transformation were engaged in something that partook of the sacred, and the objects they produced carried something of that sacred quality. The administrative systems that emerged to manage Egyptian copper production in the late pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods were among the most sophisticated organizational achievements of the ancient world. Temple complexes at major centers like Hierakonpolis and Abydos served as nodes in a distribution network that moved raw materials from desert and Sinai mining sites to urban workshops, directed finished products to their designated uses, and maintained the labor records and production accounts that allowed the system to be managed efficiently over time and space. The priests and administrators who managed these systems were developing, in the process, the record-keeping practices that would eventually crystallize into the hieroglyphic writing system, one of humanity's most consequential inventions, and one whose origins lie at least partly in the administrative demands of managing complex economic systems. The environmental challenges of Egyptian copper production, the heat, the lack of water, the distance, the logistical complexity, were not simply obstacles to be overcome. They were shapers of the social forms that Egyptian civilization developed. The requirement for large, organized, provisioned expeditions to distant resource sources created the administrative experience and the institutional frameworks that the early Egyptian state would leverage for many other purposes. The organization of agricultural labor for irrigation maintenance, the mobilization of workers for pyramid construction, the management of military campaigns into Sinai and Nubia. Egypt learned to organize complexity in the desert, and that experience made it capable of organizational achievements that would astonish later observers for millennia. The legacy of this early copper mining infrastructure was not only organizational, it was also territorial. The expeditions that Egyptian communities sent into the eastern desert and the Sinai Peninsula were not merely commercial ventures. They were, progressively, assertions of territorial control, claims to exclusive access over resource deposits that other communities might otherwise have sought to exploit. The fortified outposts and administrative installations that appear at Sinai mining sites in the early dynastic period represent the first clear evidence of what would become a characteristic feature of Egyptian imperialism. The extension of state control over territory, not for purposes of settlement or agricultural exploitation, but for control of specific, valuable resources. The pattern established by copper mining would be repeated in later centuries for turquoise, for gold, for timber, and for the exotic animals and luxury materials of sub-Saharan Africa. Egypt's strategic geography, surrounded by desert on 3 sides and by the sea on the 4th, made resource acquisition through organized expedition rather than territorial conquest a necessity and then a habit. The Indus Valley's obsession with perfection and the system that measured an entire world, there is a particular form of intellectual beauty that emerges from the pursuit of standardization, from the recognition that consistency, predictability, and commensurability are values worth achieving for their own sake, not merely as means to particular practical ends. The civilization that flourished in the Indus Valley between approximately 3,300 and 1,900 BC, known to archaeologists as the Harappan Civilization, after the Pakistani city near whose outskirts its first major site was identified in the 1920s, pursued this form of beauty with a systematic rigor that remains astonishing even to modern eyes, accustomed to industrial standardization, backed by centuries of scientific measurement and computer-aided precision. The standardization that characterizes the Harappan world is visible at every scale, from the microscopic to the urban. The fired bricks used in construction throughout the civilization's territory, a territory spanning more than 1 million square kilometers across what are now Pakistan and northwestern India, followed a consistent ratio of 1 to 2 to 4 in their 3 dimensions, regardless of the specific size of brick produced. This ratio is not arbitrary. It is the ratio that produces the most stable interlocking pattern when bricks are laid in the bonding courses that give a wall its structural integrity. The Harappan bricklayers understood, from practical experience accumulated over generations, that this ratio produced better walls than any other. And they implemented this understanding with such consistency that a brick produced at Mohenjo-Daro in the Sindh region of present-day Pakistan and a brick produced at Harappa in the Punjab region, 600 kilometers to the northeast, followed the same proportional specification. The same commitment to standardized proportion is visible in the urban planning of the major Harappan cities. Mohenjo-Daro, the largest excavated Harappan site with an estimated population at its peak of 40,000 to 80,000 people, was laid out on a grid pattern with major streets running north-south and east-west, intersected by lanes that provided access to residential blocks. The major streets were sufficiently wide, up to 10 meters in some cases, to accommodate the 2-wheeled carts pulled by bullocks that appear to have been the primary means of intra-urban transport. The residential blocks defined by the street grid were themselves subdivided in ways that provided each house with access to the drainage system that was among the most remarkable features of Harappan urban infrastructure. This drainage system deserves particular attention because it represents a level of commitment to public health engineering that has few parallels in the ancient world and that would not be approached again in urban planning practice until the Roman period. Every house in the major Harappan cities was connected to covered drains that ran beneath the streets, carrying wastewater away from residential areas to collection points outside the settlement boundaries. The drains were constructed from carefully fitted brick with removable stone covers that allowed for inspection and cleaning. They incorporated settling chambers at regular intervals that removed solid waste before the liquid effluent was discharged, and inspection shafts permitted maintenance workers to identify and clear blockages without dismantling the infrastructure. This was not merely practical engineering. It was a declaration of values, a statement that the health and comfort of the urban population was worth the substantial investment that such infrastructure required, and that maintaining it was a legitimate and important collective responsibility. The metallurgical practices of the Harappan civilization reflected the same commitment to standardization that characterized their urban planning and construction. Copper and bronze objects recovered from Harappan sites throughout the civilization's territory show a consistency of alloy composition and manufacturing technique that suggests production was governed by specifications rather than by the individual judgment of each craftsman. Agricultural tools typically contain lower concentrations of tin, the alloying element that increases hardness, than weapons and cut-on implements, reflecting an understanding that different applications required different material properties and a capacity to control alloy composition precisely enough to optimize for those properties consistently. The workshop areas where this metallurgical production took place were organized with a thoroughness that reflects systematic rather than improvised production planning. At the site of Harappa itself, excavations have revealed copper-working installations positioned near the settlement's periphery, a location that minimized fire risk to residential areas while maintaining logistical connection to the distribution networks that moved raw materials in and finished products out. The workshops contained furnaces designed for controlled smelting operations, standardized molds for casting objects to predetermined specifications, and finishing areas where products received the surface treatments and final shaping that completed their manufacture. The raw materials required for Harappan metallurgy came from sources distributed across a vast geographic range. Copper ore was transported from deposits in Rajasthan, hundreds of kilometers to the southeast of the major Harappan population centers. Tin, the element that transforms copper into bronze, and that is among the rarest of useful metals in its geographic distribution, came from sources in Afghanistan. Lapis lazuli for the decorative objects that were among the Harappan civilization's most distinctive luxury productions came from Badakhshan, also in Afghanistan. Gold came from Karnataka, far to the south. The supply chains that delivered these materials to the urban workshops where they were processed represented a logistical achievement of the first order, requiring coordination among many communities and institutions across distances that, at the pace of ancient transport, represented journeys of weeks or months. The weight and measurement system used throughout the Harappan world provides perhaps the clearest illustration of the civilization's commitment to standardization and of the administrative capabilities that this commitment implied. Stone weights recovered from Harappan sites follow a consistent binary and decimal progression, a mathematical system in which each weight is a precise multiple of a standard unit, allowing transactions of any scale to be measured using combinations of weights from the same set. The smallest Harappan weights are precise to fractions of a gram, requiring manufacturing techniques of extraordinary accuracy. The largest are sufficient for measuring bulk commodities by the kilogram. The consistency of this weight system across the entire territory of the civilization, spanning more than 1 million square kilometers, implies either a central authority capable of producing and distributing standardized weights, or a system of verification and calibration so well established that independent production at different locations nonetheless converged on the same specifications. The administrative apparatus that sustained this degree of standardization across such a vast territory is one of the great mysteries of Harappan studies. The Harappan script, a writing system that appears on thousands of seals, pottery vessels, and other objects throughout the civilization's territory, remains undeciphered despite decades of scholarly effort. Without access to the Harappan written record, we cannot know the details of the institutional structures that managed the civilization's economy, adjudicated disputes, or maintained the standards of production and measurement that defined the Harappan approach to material culture. The script's consistency across the civilization's territory, like the consistency of its weights and its bricks, implies the existence of some administrative framework capable of maintaining shared conventions across great distances. But the nature of that framework, whether it's centered on political authority, religious organization, merchant guilds, or some combination of these, remains open. What is clear is that the Harappan civilization achieved a level of economic integration and organizational sophistication that allowed it to sustain urban populations on a scale not matched in South Asia for another 2,000 years. The cities of the Indus Valley were not merely large, they were functional, designed and maintained to provide their inhabitants with a quality of daily life that included reliable water supply, effective waste management, standardized building materials, and access to the products of a continent-spanning trade network. That this achievement was accomplished without the monumental palaces, elaborate royal tombs, or martial iconography that mark the contemporary civilizations of Egypt and Mesopotamia suggests that the Harappan world had developed a different model of social organization, less visibly hierarchical, less focused on the glorification of individual rulers, more oriented toward the collective management of shared resources and shared infrastructure. The decline of the Harappan civilization, which occurred between approximately 1900 and 1700 BC, remains as puzzling as its organizational structure. The major cities were not destroyed by invasion or conquest, as far as the archaeological evidence indicates. They were gradually abandoned, depopulated over the course of a century or more, as their inhabitants relocated to smaller sites to the east and south. In what appears to have been a progressive reorganization of settlement patterns rather than a sudden catastrophe. The most plausible current explanations center on climate change, specifically a multi-decadal drought that appears to have affected the Indian subcontinent around 2200 BC, disrupting the monsoon patterns that agricultural production depended on, and on changes in the courses of the rivers that had sustained the major cities, particularly the drying of the Ghaggar-Hakra river system that had supported a significant proportion of Harappan settlement. Whatever the specific causes, the result was the disappearance from the archaeological record of one of the ancient world's most distinctive and accomplished experiments in standardized, planned urban civilization. The death of Ötzi, the coming of tin bronze, and the end of an age. In the autumn of 1991, two German hikers making their way across the Ötztal Alps on the border between Austria and Italy came upon something lying in a melting glacier at an altitude of 3,210 meters. The thing they found was dark and desiccated, its contorted posture suggesting violent end rather than peaceful rest. It was a human being, a man who had lain in this ice since approximately 3,300 BC, preserved with extraordinary completeness by the cold and the continuous pressure of glacial ice that had covered and protected him from the decomposition that destroys ordinary organic material within decades. In the months that followed his discovery, the man who came to be known as Ötzi the Iceman became one of the most thoroughly studied individuals in the history of archaeology, and what his body, his equipment, and the manner of his death revealed about the world of the late Copper Age proved to be both detailed and disturbing. Ötzi was approximately 45 years old when he died, an age that in the late 4th millennium BC represented the outer range of normal human lifespan, and one that implies a man who had survived whatever mixture of violence, disease, accident, and ordinary hardship his world offered to a degree that relatively few of his contemporaries had managed. His physical remains showed evidence of a hard-used life, arthritis in his knees, hips, and ankles, consistent with decades of mountain travel over rough terrain. Wear patterns on his teeth consistent with using them as tools in the way that many traditional cultures employ the mouth as a third hand for gripping and working fibrous materials, and healed fractures in several ribs, indicating past trauma that he had survived. He was not a young adventurer experiencing his first serious danger. He was a mature man familiar with hardship, equipped with the accumulated knowledge and equipment of a lifetime in the mountains, and still, in the end, unable to escape the violence that caught up with him on that particular September afternoon. The equipment Ötzi carried when he died represents the full toolkit of a competent and well-prepared late Copper Age traveler, and each item in that toolkit tells a story about the technological world he inhabited. His copper-bladed axe, the oldest complete axe yet discovered, with its blade, its yew wood handle, its birch tar adhesive, and its leather binding all intact, is perhaps the most important single artifact from the Copper Age in terms of what it demonstrates about the level of metallurgical and craft integration that had been achieved by this date. The blade itself, measuring 9.5 centimeters in length and weighing 224 grams, was cast from copper with a trace arsenic content of approximately 0.22%, a composition that enhanced the blade's hardness compared to pure copper without requiring the deliberate addition of alloying elements. Chemical analysis has traced the ore source of this copper to the Mondsee mining district of Austria, approximately 200 kilometers from where Ötzi died. His axe, in other words, was a product of the long-distance trade networks that connected different regions of the Alpine world, not something he could have produced from locally available materials, but something that arrived in his possession through a series of exchanges whose specific details we will never know. The circumstances of Ötzi's death were determined not through the examination of the body alone, but through a combination of forensic medical analysis and the careful study of the equipment found with him. The fatal wound was not immediately obvious. It required X-ray examination to reveal the arrowhead embedded in Ötzi's left shoulder, its stone tip lodged between the acromion and the shoulder blade in a position that indicated the arrow had been fired from below and to the rear, penetrating from an angle that implies Ötzi was moving uphill, probably running, when he was shot. The wound severed the subclavian artery, causing rapid and fatal blood loss. He would have collapsed within minutes of being struck, too far from any settlement for rescue, in a mountain environment that offered no possibility of the kind of medical intervention that might have saved him. The arrow that killed him was not fired accidentally or carelessly. The angle of the wound, the trajectory of the shot through difficult mountain terrain, and the precision required to strike a moving target at the range and under the conditions that the alpine environment implies, speak to an archer who was skilled, purposeful, and aggressive. Ötzi was being pursued, and his pursuer was determined and capable. This was not a chance encounter turned violent. It was a planned killing, an assassination, or the conclusion of a chase that had begun some distance away and in some conflict whose origins we cannot now determine. The equipment that Ötzi was carrying at the time of his death suggests that he was aware of danger and had been traveling in defensive posture for some time before the fatal encounter. His bow, made of yew wood and not yet complete, lacking the final finishing of the tips that would have allowed it to be strung and used, indicates that he was in the process of replacing damaged equipment. A completed bow had either broken or been lost or taken, and he was making a new one from scratch, carrying the unfinished product along with his other equipment. His quiver contained 14 arrow shafts, of which only 2 had been completed with flint points and feathers. The rest were raw shafts awaiting finishing that had either not yet been done or had been expended in earlier encounters. He was a man whose combat supplies had been depleted, who was working to replenish them while continuing to travel through hostile territory. The world in which Ötzi traveled and died was a world experiencing the kind of social stress that made such violence endemic rather than exceptional. The Alpine regions of the late 4th millennium BC were territories where multiple communities with competing interests, control over mountain passes, access to copper deposits, dominance over trade routes, were in regular contact and regular conflict. The copper mining complex at Mondsee that had supplied the ore for Ötzi's axe blade was itself a site of intensive exploitation and presumably of competition. The mine shafts at this and related Austrian sites extend more than 100 meters into mountainsides, representing enormous labor investments that communities would not willingly allow rivals to share or seize. The skeletal evidence from sites across the Alpine region and surrounding areas confirms that the violence of which Ötzi's death is a single documented instance was widespread and systematic during this period. At Aspern-Schletz in Austria, the remains of more than 60 individuals killed in a systematic attack on a fortified settlement have been recovered, victims of what appears to have been a deliberate assault aimed at eliminating or displacing an entire community rather than raiding it for portable wealth. The injuries documented on these skeletons were inflicted by copper axes, arrows with flint tips, and blunt force weapons, the full toolkit of late Copper Age violence, deployed not in individual conflict, but in organized, collective killing. The bell-beaker phenomenon, which spread across Western Europe beginning around 2800 BC, carried copper-working technology across distances that had not previously been connected by consistent cultural exchange. The characteristic bell-beaker assemblage, the bell-shaped pottery vessel, the flat copper dagger, the stone wrist guard, the gold ornament, appears at sites from Iberia to Britain to the Rhine Valley within a relatively short period, suggesting movement of people rather than simple diffusion of ideas. Ancient DNA analysis of individuals buried with bell-beaker goods has confirmed what the archaeological evidence suggested. These were in significant part migrating populations, carrying their material culture with them as they moved into new territories and, as the evidence of conflict suggests, often displacing or absorbing the populations they encountered. The critical technological development that would ultimately end the Copper Age and inaugurate the Bronze Age was underway before these social disruptions reached their maximum intensity. The systematic production of tin bronze, a copper-tin alloy that offered significant advantages over pure copper, or the arsenic-copper alloys that had previously served as the primary improvement on plain copper. Tin bronze is harder than pure copper, maintains a sharper edge for longer, and can be cast into more complex shapes without the brittleness problems that affected earlier experimental alloys. Its properties are also more consistent and predictable, because tin, unlike the trace arsenic that occurred naturally in some copper ores, had to be deliberately added, allowing craftsmen to control the composition of their alloy with a precision that nature-dependent alloying could not provide. The obstacles to widespread tin bronze production were primarily logistical rather than technical. Tin deposits are far less common than copper deposits in their geographic distribution, and the tin sources available to ancient Mediterranean and European communities, Cornwall in Britain, Bohemia in Central Europe, the Erzgebirge Mountains on the German-Czech border, and deposits in Afghanistan, were often distant from the copper sources with which they needed to be combined. The development of tin bronze production therefore required the establishment of long-distance trading relationships specifically for tin, relationships that added another layer of logistical complexity to already complex supply chains, and that gave communities well-positioned in those supply chains significant advantages over those who were not. By approximately 2500 BC, the tin bronze was being produced systematically at sites in Anatolia and the Eastern Mediterranean, and the superior performance of bronze weapons in the military conflicts that were intensifying across the region during this period created powerful incentives for adoption wherever the necessary raw materials could be obtained. Bronze sword blades, a weapon form that was impossible in pure copper, which lacked the structural integrity for long-cutting blades, gave bronze armed forces decisive advantages in individual combat. Bronze-tipped spears and arrows achieved greater penetration against the leather armor that was becoming increasingly common. Bronze tools were more durable and maintained sharper edges for longer, reducing the labor required for the resharpening that metal tools demanded after extended use. The collapse of the Copper Age was not a single event, but a transition, a period of several centuries during which the old social and economic structures of the Copper Age were progressively replaced by the new configurations of the Bronze Age. Many of the communities that had flourished during the height of the Copper Age did not survive this transition intact. The Cucuteni Tripilia mega-settlements had already collapsed. The Varna culture had long since transformed into something else. The Los Malares culture of Iberia, which had built some of Europe's most sophisticated fortifications and metallurgical complexes, was declining by 2200 BC and effectively gone by 2000 BC. What replaced these communities was not a void, but a new configuration. The palace-centered societies of the early Bronze Age, with their more sharply defined hierarchies, their more developed administrative technologies, and their military organizations built around the decisive advantage of bronze weapons. The administrative experience accumulated during the Copper Age, the temple bureaucracies of Mesopotamia, the mining expedition management of Egypt, the weight standardization of the Harappan world, the trade route control of Troy, provided the institutional templates from which Bronze Age administration would develop. The trade networks of the Copper Age became, with modifications reflecting the new geography of tin supply, the trade networks of the Bronze Age. The social structures of craft specialization, hereditary status, and institutionalized inequality that the Copper Age had developed became the social structures within which Bronze Age civilization operated. The story of the Copper Age, then, is not the story of a failed experiment or a dead end. It is the story of 2,000 years of accelerating human complexity, of the development, through trial and error and genuine innovation, of the social tools that would allow human communities to organize themselves at scales and levels of sophistication that none of their predecessors had imagined possible. The craftsmen who first noticed the peculiar behavior of the green-tinged stones on the Anatolian highlands could not have foreseen where that observation would lead. But the world we inhabit today, with its cities, its institutions, its inequalities, its trade networks, and its capacity for both remarkable cooperation and devastating violence, is continuous with the world that observation eventually produced. The copper that first bent, rather than shattered under the hammerstone, bent the course of human history, and the bend has never been straightened. The ice that preserved Ötzi for 5,000 years has now melted around the spot where he fell, exposing to the modern air the last traces of a world that vanished before the first pyramid was built. other glaciers are melting too, across the Alps and around the world, and archaeologists expect them to yield more of what the ice preserved. More tools, more equipment, more frozen moments from an age we are only beginning to understand. Each discovery adds a detail to a picture that remains in its broad outlines. One of the most consequential stories in the human past, the Copper Age made us in ways we are still discovering, and the age that followed it, the Bronze Age, with its empires and its cities and its literature and its wars, was only possible because the Copper Age had done its work first. Sleep now, if you will, in the knowledge that the world you inhabit did not arrive fully formed. It was made, slowly, by people who did not know they were making it. Craftsmen and traders, miners and administrators, warriors and farmers, all of them working within the constraints and opportunities of their moment in history, all of them contributing, without knowing it, to a transformation that would not reveal its full implications for millennia. The green-tinged stones of the Anatolian highlands are still there, weathering patiently in the highland air, as they have weathered since before the first human hand reached down to pick one up. They do not know what they started, but we are beginning to understand.